So because we had a chance to speculate about why so many people are looking forward to checking out the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, that brings up a question, which is when you bring it back a little bit and talk about the overall action RPG genre, especially somebody like BioWare has just an incredible library of games, not just with Mass Effect, but also Knights of the Old Republic, that does bring up the question of what makes a good action RPG? We've previously gone back on this podcast and talked about
BioWare is what makes good actionware or actionware RPGs.
Hey,
that's probably a thing, right?
They should. Is that like a Metroidvania?
It's an actionware, a BioWare RPG.
So, when not talking about BioWare, if you were to just say, okay, this is an awesome action RPG, just generally speaking, what is like the first one that comes to mind for you?
So I think we even need to peel it back an extra layer and define, because I think it's such an open term, what is an action RPG? Because it is let's dissect the words action RPG, where it is a role-playing game where action takes place.
There's action.
That's kind of every video game ever, isn't it? You are playing the role
RPG
of something
with action.
Yeah, it is a game where you are playing the role of a character and actions are taking place. So I always get a kick out of that term, but no, jokes aside, it is a little more defined in the video game space as it's a game that has maybe a loot or a leveling system, and it's not turn-based. It's more like Twitch or skill-based, or it's more real-time. So for me, I usually think of games like Dragon Age, even though that's a Bethesda one, because it's the game that took your turn-based or your turn-based games and made the BioWare formula more real-time. Dragon Age was a big one with that, and it modernized Baldur's Gate is pretty much what I'm trying to say. But outside of BioWare, you have your games like Diablo, which I think is a big one. Your Fallout, your Bethesda games. I think if you were talking about the action RPG genre, it's kind of the two pillars of it are Bethesda and BioWare. So basically those type of games, the game where you are either given this role as a character and you are following their story, or it is open enough that you that you have the ability to make your own story.
I think that's a pretty good general way to talk about it. At least for me, I actually go back to something like Star Ocean, the second story on the PS1, and that game, I would brand it an action RPG, because I think when you think about RPGs, it's usually turn-based, right? So the obvious examples are like Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and forget about the turn-based stuff, there's a lot of decision-making. Even if it's not with the story, it's like, hey, which type of weapon do you want? Do you want to be more defensive, offensive? You get the mage, you get the thief. You have a lot of decision-making. But with a game like Star Ocean, you had all of that. You also had things like crafting elements, but the actual battle, the fighting, was live. And that's something that I think a lot of people, it persuaded them to get into RPGs, because I think a lot of people enjoyed the decision-making. It's like, Keith, what is your build going to be? But then turn-based fights would start. It's like, oh, they're just standing there. They're just sitting there. And I think that's what a lot of people like. And for me, a game that it's technically an action RPG, but a lot of people don't necessarily look at it that way, is like Yakuza, right? Because when you look at a game like Yakuza, it's 100%. Not a beat 'em up. Like, you beat people up, but there's a lot of decision making that goes along. There's skill trees, you level your character up. But
and it's almost in the BioWare side of things, where you are playing the role of this character, with Yakuza in that case being Kiryu, and you are experiencing their story. You are playing the role of Kiryu through this action game.
And I think a lot of the elements with action RPGs is also turn-based for me. kind of takes you out, because even think about the beginning of Final Fantasy VII, bombing mission. Everybody's running, so then you're standing still.
And then you stand there like this for a minute or two, and then you hit the guy a few times, and then it's over. It's hard to keep that pace up.
Exactly, where with like a Mass Effect or Dragon Age, it's like you're experiencing a similar story, but you're moving. And I think that immersion is definitely in there. So you brought up things like Dragon Age. You can talk about Knights of the Republic, a lot of games like this. But what is like the one that you're thinking, hey, either I would love to go back, or this is a great example of an action RPG done right?
Outside of those ones?
Yeah.
We've mentioned the two pillars that I love so much, and I think even though you could argue that it doesn't really fall under that, but I would be a person that would say Diablo is a very good example of an action RPG as well, because it leans more on the action side of things than the role-playing game side of things, but you are still playing the role of a character class.
Absolutely.
You go into the game, you pick if you want to be in Diablo 2. We'll use this as an example because I've been thinking a lot about it lately with that remaster, and I can't wait to play it. I want to just go deep into Diablo 2 again. Like the fact that you are making that choice of, do you want to be the necromancer, the paladin, the druid, the barbarian? That is a role that you are choosing to play in this action game, and it's less about story, and even though it's there, and it's more about the action that you are doing and collecting your loot and making your guys stronger and going through that cycle that really isn't that different than the other games that we've spoken about, like the Dragon Ages, like the Final Fantasies, the Fallouts. It's just a little less story and a little more action.
I think this even takes us back to the arcades, because when I think about action RPGs, even though I don't know if it could be more like a hack and slash, it's like Gauntlet. When I think about Diablo, right,
yeah,
to me,
kinda.
Diablo is like the evolution of Gauntlet, because one of my biggest complaints with arcade games is what happens. It's like an arcade game is great for the arcade, but the complaint that I had as a kid is when you bring that home, you realize, oh, the quarter...
It's built to suck quarters out of your wallet, and
you
once that's gone, it's not that fun.
It's like, okay, I have my character, but the RPG element's like, okay, you get the action, but now you get to make more decisions. There's a reason to go back, and more often than not, and you brought up a great example with Diablo, is you can max out a character. Guess what? You can start all over again, brand new difficulty, brand new class, and you can do that. One game that I really love, and these games are going up in price a lot, are the Champions of Noroth, the Return to Arn games on PS2.
Yeah, you were really into those games, I remember, back in like the PS2 era.
And they're still awesome. Like, I recently went back and played some of them because of like the whole nostalgia. Is that going to be bad? And my first reaction was, first of all, damn, it's difficult. It's really hard to play, but it's like amazing gameplay. You brought up Baldur's Gate, and I think it's, you spend, let me know what you think about this. Even with Mass Effect, there's a lot of decision making. I feel like it is an action RPG, not RPG with action, if you know what I mean. Like, the emphasis at the end of the day is when you go to that battle, the decisions you've made flourish. Whereas a turn-based RPG, it feels like the battle is there to bridge the gap with the story. So it's kind of different, right?
It's the part that makes it more of a video game in the turn-based, where there's always it's the part that separates the narrative. Like, you need to get to the battle to get to the next part of the story, where a lot of times in the action RPGs, the battle and the story almost blend together and to become the same thing.
Absolutely. So what would you say is one of the things that is non-negotiable for you? I think everybody has pet peeves with a game, right? Like in my case, if you tell me there's a starvation element to a game, that is my biggest turn off.
Yeah,
but
no thanks.
yeah, I just don't like it. But focusing on the must-haves, so it's like that one thing that you have got to have, or that they got to get right in order for you to enjoy an action RPG.
They need to check. It can be either or, but they need to either check the strong characters box or the strong world box. Like, you need something to keep me engaged, whether it be I want to experience this world that they build, or I want to learn more about the characters that they've developed and their stories, because that's really, in my opinion, the biggest driving force of these games, even beyond the actual gameplay itself. Because yes, I get that the gameplay needs to be fun and it needs to be a good loop, but you need that reason to drive forward and actually enjoy it. Because one example that I always think of constantly is Two Worlds. It's a game for the Xbox 360 that should have succeeded, in my opinion, but because it had like the formula behind it to be a good one of those games, but it just felt soulless in actual execution. Like, it was, here, go do this quest, you don't really care about the characters, the gameplay's kind of mediocre, the world's just green field after green field after brown field after river, and you just, like, there was no soul to it. So that's really the game that made me realize you need one or the other to succeed.
I think that's a really good example. For me, I'm a big fan of beat 'em ups and hack and slash. So for the gameplay side, something that I need is just have it flow. There's been a lot of like pretty good action RPGs, but when you start playing and you feel that animation, right? It's like, when a game is good, you don't even notice the little things. But then you'll play a game that has that jank, right? Where you got to press the button and just something feels off. That really throws me away. But then if you only give me the action, you lose me. But then
especially
on the flip side,
in an action RPG, it's really easy if a game works for your brain to almost go on autopilot. Like, you know the things that you are supposed to do with the character that you are using, and your brain just kind of makes it happen. And the second that you're taken out of that and you have to think about what you're doing, it loses me. I'm with you there.
And I think something that Mass Effect 2 did really good for me is that the lore is almost more important than the story, because I'm not saying the story is not important, but sometimes a game will have like a really bad story, but just shove it down your throat. And it's like, dude, I get it. You're trying really hard, but I'm not clicking. But if at least the world, if I believe that I'm in space, right? Not that, oh, well, they put the space texture, that breaks the immersion. Whereas if I feel like I'm a mercenary, if I feel like I'm on a suicide mission or something like that, that gives me purpose. And that makes every punch, every kick, or every sword slash mean that much better. And I feel
because
like
really
that's
in
what
Mass Effect 2, there's not a lot of story. You have the basic idea that you're given at the beginning, but then it's a game spent around character work. And I think that's why it's so successful, in my opinion. They took the time and they took a game to be able to make this threat feel like universe ending, and you have to go to extremes just to have a little bit of a chance against it. And that whole game is character work to build that squad to give you that chance.
And I think the best stories, even when you think about movies, right? Lord of the Rings. What is like the short form version of the story? Hey, we got to get rid of this ring. That's the story, right? In itself, that is the story.
Frodo is in danger. Frodo dies. Frodo doesn't die. The end.
Exactly. But then the character building that you mentioned, that makes you care about the journey. We got 3 movies out of that, right? And some people could say, well, let me ask you this. It's the justification.
To kind of go on that point, if you did not care about the Fellowship of the Ring, that group of characters, would those movies be half as revered as they would be today?
Exactly. No, that's a great point. And with it's hard to just not flat out talk about BioWare again, but something that they've been really good at least with most of the games that I played, even going back to like a Jade Empire, right, which is a game that a lot of people forget about, is you care about the characters, and they try really hard to be like, hey, maybe this character is not your cup of tea. Maybe you find this character annoying, but somebody's going to click with that. And I feel like some games try to have too many neutral I'm saying this with quotes.
Yeah, they
Characters.
want they want somebody to fall in love with every character, and to the
Exactly.
point where they almost get homogenized and none of them are unique. Where in a BioWare game, even in the bad BioWare games, because we're talking about BioWare with all this reverence, but really I think up until the last console generation, like the PS4 era, they fell off a cliff there, to be straight, as far as I'm concerned. But even in the bad BioWare games, your Mass Effect Andromeda and your Dragon Age Inquisition, the characters are still good because they are all so different from each other. They rarely have the same traits, and you might not connect with all of them. And that's okay, because then it almost incentivizes later playthroughs to give those characters a shot. And even if it doesn't work, well, then you can just dump them and try somebody else. Like I had that exact situation in Dragon Age, the original one, because that's one of my favorite games from that console generation, where I played through that game about 4 times, and I didn't even make different decisions all that much in that game, but it was about, okay, I'm starting a new playthrough. I had these 2 people as my party last time. Now I want to try these 2 people and see how they react to scenarios and see how my playthrough differs just from having these 2 people around as main characters and not as supporting roles. And that's really, in my opinion, where the strength of those games come from.
And I think that doesn't just extend to the story, but also the gameplay. Like, if you're giving me options, they better matter, right? Because some games have had it so you can use either magic or sword, or you can just button mash X and you'll progress. And it's like, what's the point of making a decision when really it doesn't change the gameplay loop all that much? And with the story, like you're mentioning,
why do the hard thing when you can do so much less work and get the same result?
Exactly, and on the flip side, as you mentioned with the story part, is if you're giving me decisions about the story and between the characters, I hope that the actual conclusion is not, hey, everybody's happy. It's like, if there's not a threat, if a character cannot die off or something, don't even give me that option, because I feel like a lot of games sometimes are guilty of like, hey, here's 80 options, but really, Keith, you still end up in like one of the 2 scenarios.
It's a circle where you start at one point and then the circle gets bigger and that's all your choices and that's all your choices. Then you get to the bottom of the circle and you're almost funneled into the exact same scenario as everyone else.
And I think one game that we can sort of close the topic of is, I mean, there's a reason Skyrim has had like 50 different versions, despite the fact that all of them are glitchy, all of them are broken, and it's like one of those key words that everybody loves, which is immersion. People, do you want to be immersed in a video game, Keith?
Nothing says immersion like spawning in 700 cheese wheels and rolling them down a mountain, let me tells you.
Oh, yeah, but when talking about like not just Skyrim, I mean, this could be Oblivion, this could be Morrowind. Despite the fact that the game is broken, right? It's like these faults were there. The fact, kind of like Cyberpunk, like the expectation is you will encounter a glitch, but when you're in this world, you feel like you're doing something. You feel like you can make decisions. And I think a lot of people are willing to forgive some of the faults when the reason that you come into these games, in this case action RPGs, is great. Like, going back to the topic of Yakuza 6 was my first foray into the Yakuza games, which you suggested. And something that I love is like that game is tiny. If you think about the actual world, you're going back and forth.
All of them are like that. You play between like 8 city blocks.
In the same area, like Kamurocho and all that, right? Mm-hmm. So think of that challenge, right? If at any point I became aware of that as I played, boom, you're done. But then when they combine the story with like badass action, you're like, dude, I don't give a. You could make this shorter, and I would still enjoy it, because what is there? The reason that you come into a game like that is not even the story. It's like the characters and the personality, right? And then maybe the action. It'll be interesting. Like, I want to eventually play Like a Dragon, because I don't know if you saw, like, they seem to have confirmed that now going forward, Yakuza will be turn-based, and that's interesting because. Is that like the only series I can think of that went backwards. I mean, not backwards in a bad way. Just usually you see turn-based go
backwards
into
isn't
action.
the right word, but yeah, I think so. It's almost like the opposite of Final Fantasy VII, right?
Yeah.
Where they remade the game and made it a more action RPG beyond turn-based, where Yakuza's doing the complete opposite.
Exactly. And for everybody watching and listening, we really would love to know just what makes a great action RPG for you. I think to sum it up is I hate the saying that's like jack of all trades, master of none, but action RPGs need to have a little bit of something, because you can look at a game like Tetris.
They need to
right?
master one of the trades.
You got to master one of them, but you got to have a little bit more of the other stuff. Like Tetris, for example, as a game, as long as the puzzle element works, yeah, the music is important, but you're like, damn, this is like really good. But the action part of an action RPG needs to be complemented properly with the role-playing part in order for that to work, right?
100%.
And I think that's like one of the more unique genres. Like a fighting game, as long as, like, sure, you can talk about the graphics and the characters, but if the fighting flows, you can forgive a lot of that stuff. Whereas action RPG, the fact that it's like a hybrid of genres. It's very difficult.
Stories in fighting games are laughable. Up until the Mortal Kombat series, I guess it started with MK9. Like they've been laughable at this point. So it's almost like a scale where it was tilted so far in one direction in the gameplay side that you didn't even need the story side.
Exactly, and I'm happy we had this conversation, because in the podcast we haven't talked a lot about action RPGs, just because generally speaking these games last a hell of a lot longer.
They're very difficult to review, it turns out.
Exactly, and because
I'll never forgive you for not doing Knights of the Old Republic.
We'll get to it at some point. Like we'll just give you like a solo episode. I ain't even talking about Han. You can just do that by yourself.
Yeah, I don't want to do an episode about the movie Solo. No thanks. That's a terrible movie.
Oh, okay, never mind then. But everybody, join the conversation over at acastofthepast.com/Discord. If you're checking this out on podcast apps, whether it be Stitcher, Spotify, or anything like that, and you enjoy us babbling about movies, games, and all that good stuff, please consider leaving that 5-star review. This isn't just a thing people say at the end of videos and audio to sound cool. It really is the best way that you can support. Same thing with YouTube. So thank you to everybody that's been enjoying the new format. For those on the audio platform, what we've been doing is we cut up these episodes into like these specific topics. So let's say you're like, oh man, a 40-minute podcast, I ain't got time for that. Well, we split the episodes into very key topics, right? Like this one, we did Mass Effect and then overall action RPGs. You can consume that. Mm-hmm. You can check out our mugs. And I think it's sometimes more palatable for those people that don't have like that time. Like I can listen to a 3-hour podcast, but sometimes I don't have time to listen to all of it in one go. And I kind of forget and lose my track and just don't listen to the rest. So
it's why they made me suffer last week and couldn't compare Dino Crisis to other survival horror games for the first half hour of that conversation.
It's a good challenge for Keith. Right?
Exactly. It's something about growing and getting stronger and being miserable the entire time.
Exactly. And speaking of being miserable, like if you want to check out our review of Dino Crisis as you're surviving with freaking dinosaurs, that is available on the archive and the podcast app. So up until next time, thank you for watching and supporting, and we will be back with another exciting, sexy, retro-filled edition of A Cast
to the
Past. And we don't give a damn about what Ryan has to think about action RPGs. He just has to get with our opinions.
Yeah, I mean, is Pokemon an action RPG?
No,
it's a good question. It's not. Maybe like the Mystery Dungeon ones. So no, I don't care about his opinion. I guess maybe Breath of the Wild counts, but even then, whatever. Screw him.
Hey, thanks for checking out the video. If you liked it, please consider subscribing, and we are also available on podcast feeds. So search the name, click on the Sword and Stone, and enjoy a brand new episode every single Sunday.